Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Gladner. I'm the CEO of the Jewish Federation, and we're grateful for all of you joining us this evening, or this morning, excuse me. It's the evening time for our special guest, Yossi Klein Halevi, coming to us live from Jerusalem. Let me spend a minute introducing Yossi. This is the second in our, what we're calling our Thoughtful Thursday series of speakers. And we're really honored to have Yossi, who is the Senior Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. In a second, I'll ask you to explain a little bit more about your work there. He recently wrote a book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which is a phenomenal read and is a New York Times bestseller. He writes for the op-ed pages for leading papers across North America, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the LA Times. He's frequently quoted on Israeli television, on Middle Eastern Jewish affairs. You'll see him all over the place. But he's born in Brooklyn, got his BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College, his master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University. And he moved to Israel in 1982 and lives there with his wife, Sarah, who helps direct a center for Jewish meditation. And they have 3 children. So Yossi, welcome to Portland, Oregon. We're delighted to have you.
And good to be back with you, Mark.
Yes, welcome back to Portland. Why don't you tell us a little about your current work at the Shalom Hartman Institute?
So first of all, hi, everyone. Good morning and good evening from Jerusalem. I work on a project called the Muslim Leadership Initiative, MLI, which brings young emerging Muslim American leaders to Jerusalem, to the Hartman campus to study Judaism, Israel, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We've been doing it now for about 8 years. And my co-directors are Imam Abdullah Antepli from Duke University and Maytal Friedman, my colleague. And the goal of the program really is to prepare the next generation of Muslim American leaders, and I'm speaking really about people in their late 20s, 30s, for a deeper, more respectful interfaith encounter with the mainstream of the American Jewish people. And we've had over 130 people going through the program at this point.
Great. Well, thank you. So I want to welcome everybody again. And if anybody has any questions, please use the Q&A chat at the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll certainly be able to look into those. So Yossi, why don't we start with the global pandemic that's going on, and certainly what's happening in Israel. At the beginning of the pandemic, Israel seemed to be a role model for the rest of the world of how to manage it. And now it seems unmanageable in the state of Israel. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's the Israeli genius for snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory. That seems to be a pattern in other areas as well. And you know, I think the first thing that this tells us is something essential about the Israeli character, which is that we are very good at dealing with short-term emergencies and not good at all in dealing with systemic crises. So when Corona seemed to be an urgent but perhaps passing phenomenon, Israeli society was galvanized. And if anyone has ever been in Israel during a war, or in that abrupt transition from peace to war, you will have noticed the Israeli talent for immediately shifting gears. We are civilians one instant, and then we are an army, a nation under arms the next instant. We're mobilized, and we make the same transition in the other direction. As soon as the war is over, as soon as a terror attack is over, the scene of the attack is cleaned up, and you can't tell a few hours later that there's even been a terror attack. And that is something I think essential in how we cope. So that's how we coped the first wave. And I think we were fantastic. As soon as the second wave came, Israelis lost their focus. We lost interest. We lost our sense of national solidarity, which we had the first round. and we lost the plot. There are lots of characters to blame here. I would start with the prime minister, who quite simply was interested only in collecting the kudos from the first round, and then criminally allowed the second round to happen without even creating the mechanism, the government mechanism to deal with it. It was really it was a shabby performance. But the second culprit here is the ultra-Orthodox community, which is responsible for upwards of 40% of the infections in the second round. Bear in mind that until recently, we had the highest proportional infection rate in the world. And that is largely due to the ultra-Orthodox, who not only, many of them, not only failed to follow the health instructions, as we're seeing playing out in certain ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Brooklyn, for example, including the neighborhood I grew up in, Borough Park. And at the same time, the ultra-Orthodox community adopted its own health policy, a separatist health policy, to try to achieve herd immunity within their own communities. But that drove the numbers up. We, your average Israelis, were not thinking of the numbers in non-ultra-Orthodox Israel and the numbers in ultra-Orthodox Israel. We were looking at it as one society. But the ultra-Orthodox don't look at us as one society. They see themselves as a society within as a society. And so they were playing by their own rules. As a result of that, the numbers shot up. Ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, which is where most of the infections were happening. The ultra-Orthodox parties pressured Netanyahu into imposing a nationwide shutdown because they did not want to be stigmatized. You see, they create their own separatist health policy. They jack up the numbers, and then they refuse to pay the price. So the mood in this country today among people like myself is cold fury. Fury at the ultra-Orthodox, fury most of all at Netanyahu for playing politics with the economy, with people's livelihoods. Small businesses are shutting down because of this second lockdown that we've gone through. And it's all because Netanyahu did not want to alienate his ultra-Orthodox partners. The whole thing on every level is actually a disaster. And for me, Corona is the moment of truth. It's exposing exactly what the strengths are, first of all, of us as each of us as individuals. There are those who are coping with Corona more successfully in our personal lives, others less successfully. And Corona is also exposing the weaknesses in all of our societies. And that's something we have to do.
Look, we certainly have our challenges here in the United States as well in
Oh,
regards
really? I didn't hear about that.
Well, we're here to talk about Israel, so let's stay there. So let's talk about what we read a great deal about in the news is this prospect for regional peace and the agreements with Bahrain and the UAE. We read in the papers today, potentially Sudan and Saudi Arabia. So can you talk a little bit about the Abraham Accords, the impact, what this means for the Palestinians going forward, and what you see in the horizon, maybe in the next 2 or 3 years with regional peace efforts?
Well, let's start with what these accords signify, because I think that the full historical importance of these accords have not been embraced, recognized, and partly for understandable political reasons. A lot of people don't want to give Trump and Netanyahu credit for it. But these accords are, I think, the most significant peace agreements that Israel has signed since 1979, since we signed our first peace agreement with Egypt, an Arab country. And in some ways, this peace agreement goes much deeper, because this is our first truly passionate peace agreement with an Arab country. The Emirates are on fire with this agreement. I see it in my Twitter feed. I was just invited to present to a conference in the Emirates about the implications of the American elections for regional security, and that's a code word for Iran and the Iran deal. And the enthusiasm that I'm experiencing, that they're openly being able to invite Israelis to participate. Every Friday on my Twitter feed, I get Shabbat Shalom from numerous people in Hebrew from the Gulf. And there is this sense of, damn it, we're sick of this war. We're sick of 70 years of an unnatural relationship between the two most successful countries in the Middle East. And this peace is being driven by two factors. One is Israeli power, military power, a shared fear of Iran, and a need for Israeli protection against potential Iranian aggression. And the second force driving this is the Israeli economy, the great success story of the last 20, 30 years in Israel. And so it is various forms of Israeli power that has created this peace, and that really is a vindication for Israel's long-term strategy of normalization. Before I get to the Palestinians, I just want to play this out a little bit more, because I read an editorial, some of you may have seen it, in the New York Times after the accord was signed, dismissing the significance of the peace agreement, saying that it isn't really a peace agreement because the UAE and Israel and Bahrain were never technically in a war. And that's true if we're speaking about a military conflict. But if you go back to 1974, right after the Yom Kippur War, the single greatest strategic threat that Israel ever faced diplomatically was the Arab oil boycott. And that boycott was being led by the Saudis, by the Gulf states, by Bahrain. And because of the oil boycott, the UN passed the Zionism Racism Resolution in 1975. Western Europe turned against Israel. It wasn't out of any sudden humanitarian concern for the Palestinians. It was out of fear of losing Arab oil. Almost all of Africa severed relations with Israel because of Arab oil pressure. And so we were on our way to becoming a pariah state. And the great irony, the vindication of this moment, is that it is precisely the same countries that were driving Israel's isolation half century ago that are now pushing for normalization. I think we need to just step back for a moment, not play our internal politics. I wish it wasn't Netanyahu and Trump who delivered this deal. But as we say in Hebrew, ma lasot, what can you do? Zemayesh. That's who did it. And I think this is one of the great moments in the history of Israel. Now, in terms of the Palestinians, I understand Palestinian anger and Palestinian frustration, but I wish that Palestinians would be asking themselves some hard questions. And the first hard question is, how did we get here? How do we get to the point where, for all practical purposes, the Arab world is declaring an end to its war against Israel? Extraordinary. It is declaring its satiation point. It has reached the point of satiation with the Palestinian issue. And it no longer wants to continue paying the military and political price, frankly, for Palestinian rejectionism of all these years. We saw that in an extraordinary speech that was delivered by the former Saudi ambassador to the US a couple weeks ago, Bandar. blamed the Palestinian leadership for rejecting peace agreement. And, you know, for me, and I think for most Israelis, this is a Dayenu moment. You know, like finally, there are voices in the Arab world that are telling the Palestinian leadership, you helped bring this on yourselves. Now, I don't absolve my side for our share of responsibility in this conflict, for settlement expansion, for speaking to the Palestinians only in the language of security and threat and not reconciliation. We have our share, more than our share, in perpetuating this conflict. But time and again, at crucial moments, when there was a credible deal on the table, we said yes, the Palestinian leadership said no. Now, you can't understand Israeli society today. You can't understand people like myself who believe deeply in a two-state solution, but are so fed up with the Palestinian leadership that we welcome a peace agreement with an Arab country that bypasses the Palestinian. But having said that, I don't believe we can bypass the Palestinian issue indefinitely. And I see a potential here for the first time in many years, for expanding the circle of peace talks to include Arab countries. And I'm going to use a term that I've never used in my life, and that is Arab allies. For the first time in Israel's history, we have Arab allies. That means we have people that we can sit with and say, listen, these are our security concerns about a Palestinian state. How can we work together to help neutralize some of these threats? How do we together help empower the moderate forces in Palestinian society? How do we create the dynamic where more and more Palestinians will understand that there will be no return of the descendants of refugees to the state of Israel? When I'm asked how many Palestinian refugees or descendants of refugees from 48 Israel should be prepared to accept, my answer is the same as Tzipi Livni's. Tzipi Livni was one of the heads of the Labor Party, a leading Israeli dove, and Tzipi said exactly zero. Not one Palestinian returns to the state of Israel. Palestinian return to the state of Palestine, Jewish return to the state of Israel. That's the deal. And if there will be Palestinian leaders ready to make that deal, you will have many of us here in Israel standing up and saying, now is the time to go for it, with the change this time that we will have Arab allies supporting the process.
So Yossi, just two questions for you as a follow-up. One is, the arrangements for this peace agreement didn't just happen yesterday. The seeds were sown previously.
Yeah.
Did it with the Bush administration, the Obama administration, or was it really, at this point in time, they were able to get over the hump? So can you talk about that? And number two is, who do you see next as maybe the dominoes start to fall of countries who reach out to Israel to make peace?
Look, I think that the person who deserves the lion's share of credit for this deal is Barack Obama. And the reason for that is that his Iran deal was so detested by both Israelis and Arabs that it brought us together in shared fear of what we felt, almost all of us felt, was an historic disaster. And the Iran deal really threatened to empower Iran first as a conventional power with a tremendous infusion of cash, trade, and further down the line, Iran would eventually become a nuclear power because its nuclear it was allowed to remain on the nuclear threshold, and there were these insane sunset clauses. And so this shared dread of the Iran deal brought the Saudis and the Gulf states to knock on Israel's door. And that, of course, was an unintended consequence, but it is the great silver lining. And so we don't always know in advance what our policies and intentions will actually create. And in this case, this the Iran deal gave birth to the Israeli-Sunni anti-Iranian relationship, which in turn gave birth to this formal and passionate peace agreement. Now, who's next? I spoke to some Sudanese the other day on Zoom, and my sense is that there's a great deal of grassroots support in Sudan for this. I don't like the way the Trump administration has been strong arming Sudan into making peace with Israel. That's not the way I would like to see this happen. But the fact that there is so much grassroots support, apparently, in the Sudan for normalization makes me feel a little bit better about the deal. And it has tremendous strategic implications. You look at a map, you see where Sudan is sitting. That Sudan is sitting on one of the most crucial points for Israeli security, sitting on the Red Sea. The Six-Day War happened because Nasser shut the Red Sea to Israeli commerce. And to now have all along the Red Sea, the Saudis, the Sudanese, the Red Sea is becoming an Israel-friendly zone. And that is an extraordinary reversal of 1967. In fact, I should write that down because I need to write an op-ed about that.
Okay.
If there's going to be Sudanese normalization, I need to write how this is, just as the deal with the Emirates was a reversal of the Arab oil boycott, the deal with Sudan is an undoing of 1967.
Okay.
So thanks for the inspiration, Mark.
Okay, terrific. Can you mention about Saudi Arabia and also Turkey and the relationship with Israel today?
Well, Saudi Arabia is, I don't believe that Saudi Arabia is going to establish diplomatic relations with Israel in the absence of a peace agreement. I think they would like to, but they are the custodians of the Islamic holy sites. And I don't think they can allow themselves to get too far in front of the Arab or Muslim consensus. And they're looking for a middle ground. Now, bear in mind that there would have been no Abraham Accords without Saudi blessing. But the Gulf states and Bahrain would have never signed this agreement without the Saudis not only tacitly agreeing, but I strongly suspect urging them to do it. So the Saudis are experiencing normalization with Israel vicariously through the Gulf. The strategic relationship with the Saudis is deepening to such an extent that one senior member of the Israeli government said to me a little while ago, he said, if you knew the extent of security cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia, you would fall off your chair. And he didn't tell me, so I didn't fall off my chair, and I can't tell you because I don't know. but apparently, it's pretty extraordinary. The Turkish relationship is one of the great failures in our 70 years of diplomatic relations with the international community. Turkey, of course, was the first Muslim country to recognize Israel in 1949, immediately. Jews of Turkey, until recently, felt secure. Turkey was the great refuge for Jews fleeing Spain in 1492. The the Ottomans may have had an ambivalent relationship toward Jews living in the land of Israel, but certainly in Turkey, there was near total acceptance. One of the most moving experiences that I had was visiting the Jewish community in Istanbul in 2013 and just seeing how deeply Jewish they are and how deeply Turkish they are. They really reminded me in some ways of the American Jewish community in that sense of feeling totally at home. And you don't see that in that many diaspora communities. They do not feel at home today. Most of the young people are either leaving or thinking of leaving. There is a great deal of fear for the future. And Turkey is no longer, by any stretch, an ally of Israel, even though, ironically, we have very extensive trade that has continued even under Erdogan. But Erdogan has allowed Turkey to become the base, the political base for Hamas. And I consider Erdogan to be one of the leading enemies of the Jewish people today, in his rhetoric, in his actions. And so Turkey has gone from being the great success story for Israeli diplomacy in the 50s and 60s to one of our great failures, just as Iran, by the way, was our second Muslim ally in the 50s up until 1979. And so the great irony for Israel, of course, is that the two non-Arab Muslim countries who were our greatest allies until not long, until the 70s or 80s, today are among our most bitter enemies. And the Arab countries, which led the war against Israel's existence for decades, are gradually becoming our close strategic allies.
Thank you. And I know people are sending some questions to the chat, so please send in your questions. We'll get to them, I promise you. Let's turn to politics for a minute here, Yossi. Let's talk a little bit about the current political situation going on in Israel, the Netanyahu government, potential for new elections. Who are the future leaders? What do you see happening in Israel today?
This is a very depressing moment for Israel politically, socially, morally. We have a prime minister for the first time in our history who is facing a trial for corruption, 3 counts of corruption. He's been indicted. We have a prime minister who has declared war against Israel's judicial system, against the police, media, against our democratic norms, against the Arab-Israeli minority. A prime minister who is delegitimizing anti-government demonstrations. We've never experienced anything quite like this, and this is the first time in my nearly 40 years of being an Israeli that I'm worried about the future of democracy. I think we'll pull through. I think we are too much of an anarchic society to become authoritarian. It negates the Israeli temperament. But Netanyahu is doing his best to undo 70 plus years of one of Israel's most remarkable achievements, which is creating a democracy, not only in the Middle East, but creating a democracy under constant war and siege and terror. There's no country, no democracy in history that was born in war and that never knew anything but war, that has been a pressure cooker throughout its entire existence. And if you factor in the amazing achievement where Israel brought in refugees from countries that never experienced democracy. 90% of Israelis come either from the Middle East or from Eastern Europe. And these were not bastions of democratic thought. and you bring refugees with no experience of democracy, traumatized refugees, into a permanent war zone, and yet our democratic institutions have not only been preserved, but in many ways have been enhanced. So that's the context that I think we need to understand this moment in. But the fact is that we are living under a sustained assault on Israeli democracy that's coming from the top. And I think the demonstrations in the streets against Netanyahu are precious. This is one of our finest moments. And just to give you a sense of where the demonstrations in Israel, the anti-government demonstrations, are different than the kind of demonstrations you've been experiencing, certainly in Portland, but in the States generally. Uh, I, I maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't seen American flags being waved at the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and other protests. The American flags that one sees at demonstrations in the States are on the right, not on the left. That's my impression. And please correct me if I'm wrong. And that's something that I think really needs to be unpacked, because if the American flag belongs to only one side of the political divide, then that's really an expression of a much deeper malaise. In Israel, when you look at the anti-government demonstrations, which are driven by what remains of the Israeli left, which is pretty marginal at this point in Israel. We don't have much of a left here. It's more center versus right. The demonstrations tend to be driven by the very small left. And yet you will see dozens of Israeli flags, big Israeli flags, at every demonstration. And so long as the anti-government demonstrations and the pro-government demonstrations are both waving the same flag, I think that Israeli society is going to maintain a minimal cohesiveness.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for that. Let's turn it around as we're embarking on our own elections here. November 3rd is election day, but we're in a state that has mail-in ballots, so I know many people have already received their ballot and mailed it in. But talk a little bit about the view from Israel on the American election. Polls have certainly come out that a large majority of Israelis are very much in support of President Trump. And talk about just the natural future of American-Israeli relations on a political level as well as on a Jewish communal level.
Well, look, I think that Israelis generally don't pay attention to what happens abroad, even in America. For all of America's importance for Israel, few Israelis really understand America. I think Israelis have only the most vague sense of Trump and why he is such a divisive figure and what he's done to American political culture of civility. Israelis kind of know, but don't really. They certainly haven't experienced it or paid attention to it on a regular basis. So, Israelis think of Obama, who was very widely feared and resented here, and think of Trump's support for Israel, which is, I think, pretty unmistakable, and draw what is a narrow conclusion based on what they perceive to be Israeli self-interest. Whether it is or not can be debated. I worry very much about maintaining bipartisan support for Israel. I think that we all know that bipartisanship is in the foundation of the American-Israeli relationship, and if that is undermined, right now it's threatened. I think it's still holding, but it's threatened. Then we are looking at a new historical period, for American-Israeli relations. And I don't think Israelis fully internalize that. So, look, I think that there are other good reasons for why American Jews tend to be uh, liberal or progressive, and Israelis tend to be conservative and hawkish. American Jews live in what is still, despite the last 4 years, the most accepting environment that Jews have ever lived in. The most tolerant, the most welcoming. And Israelis live in what has been until recently, until the Abraham Accords and whatever else might be happening in the region. Israelis have lived in the least hospitable circumstance. We have lived under constant siege and enmity. And as a result of that, each Jewish community, has developed its own necessary coping mechanism. We have related to our neighborhood through deterrence, through being the toughest kid on the block. And American Jews have related to their environment by being open and flexible and universal. And so there are good reasons why each community has developed its own politics and its own Jewish identity. Ask American Jews what's important for their Jewish identity, and they'll give you a whole list of reasons that will be very different from what Israelis would say. And that should be a given in our relationship, that we will come to very different conclusions. The question, the challenge for us, is how do we navigate that? How do we navigate a situation which a strong majority of American Jews feel that President Trump is an existential threat to the well-being of the Jewish community, if not directly because of encouraging or implicitly encouraging far right, then indirectly by creating instability and an assault on the liberal society that allowed American Jewry to thrive. And so indirectly, at least, Trump is an existential threat to American Jewry. And how do we deal with the fact that a strong majority of Israelis are pro-Trump? In other words, support a man perceived to be an existential threat by American Jews. But the opposite is also true. How do we deal with the fact that the majority of American Jews, strong majority, supported Trump and supported Obama and probably supported the Iran deal, which the overwhelming majority of Israelis regarded as an existential threat? I certainly did. I felt the Iran deal was a long-term existential threat to Israel. And American Jews, I felt, didn't get it. And so I had the same frustration for the American Jewish community, the way that American Jews today feel toward Israelis. How can you support Trump? Don't you see what he's doing to America? Don't you hear our anguish? And we were in a reverse dynamic 4 years ago. And so the question that I have for all of us, Israelis and American Jews, is how do we navigate a situation where each community now sees the other as supporting a position that is a direct threat to its well-being? We've never been in a situation like that before. That's really dangerous.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to get to your book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and we have somebody who asked a question who actually was at a book signing with you in Jerusalem. So just so you know that. But the question that they asked is, what were you hoping to accomplish by writing the book? And how might you rewrite those letters today?
So a brief word about the book for those who don't know it. It's a series of 10 letters written to an anonymous Palestinian on the next hill, literally from where I'm sitting now. I live in the last row of houses in Jerusalem before the West Bank, and I'm looking now at the lights of the Palestinian village of Nata, which is just a few hundred meters away, separated by a wall, by the security barrier. And so I wrote the book to try to start a conversation about our competing narratives. My first goal was to tell our story to Palestinians who don't know anything about who the Jews are, who don't understand how we understand ourselves, that we are a people with a religious identity and not just a religion. That's why we're here. That's why we have a land. That's why we have a sovereign state. And I wanted to unpack the complexity of Israeli identity and the Israeli experience and invite Palestinians to respond with their experience. This is the first book that's written by an Israeli seeking that kind of conversation and telling our story very much from a normative Israeli mainstream perspective. And the book was translated into Arabic and put online for free downloading, and I got hundreds of responses. And the paperback edition, which came out not long ago, has a new epilogue, 50 pages of Palestinian responses to their Israeli name. And so the book now has gone from being a blind gesture of hope that somebody on the other side is going to read this thing and respond, to actually now modeling in one book what I hope to achieve, which is how do we respectfully disagree about our irreconcilable narrative? And can we get beyond our irreconcilable narratives to look toward the future without pretending that the past isn't dividing us? So this is the very complicated dynamic that I've tried to set in motion. Until Corona happened, I was meeting with Palestinians individually in small groups and really beginning a relationship. I received a small grant to hire some people to do outreach in Arabic social media. I have a team. I have a young woman in Baghdad. I have a young man in Morocco. I have a Palestinian in the West Bank, a Palestinian woman in Jordan. I have 2 Israeli Jews. And they work to get the word out in Arabic social media. If the question is what I would do differently, what I would write differently, I don't know that I would really write much differently. The book was written 2 years ago. It was pretty much a summation of what I'd learned as an Israeli for over 4 decades. And I probably would have tried harder, based on some of the responses that I've gotten. I would have tried harder to emphasize that I understand that there's a counter narrative. I'm not asking you to accept my narrative. I do. This is my narrative. I believe that this really reflects reality. You obviously have a completely opposite narrative. And so I'm not going to war against your narrative. I'm actually asking us to create a space in which these 2 opposing narratives can coexist.
Great, thank you. And for those of you who have not seen the book, get it at Powell's. Great book, worth the read. So I want to go through some of the questions. So I know we only have about 15 minutes left, so I want to kind of get through. Somebody wanted to know a little bit more about your program that you're running at Hartmann, and with people refusing to engage with Israel, how are you able to attract the leaders that you're attracting?
Well, it's really interesting because MLI, the Muslim Leadership Initiative, the program that we run, has been a deeply divisive force in the American Muslim community, maybe the most divisive force. And we have attracted some of the leading lights within the Muslim community, people who have gone on to stellar careers as journalists and writers, as community activists, as leaders. And the fact that so many important Muslim figures have gone through our program has been a very big blow to BDS. There's no question about it. And again, a source of deep bitterness within the Muslim American community. And I'm sorry about that bitterness. That wasn't the intention. It is a consequence. But we have had some very courageous participants, people who really believe that their participation in a program of study should not be dictated by the most rigid political communal norms. That in some ways they saw this program as a test case for the ability of American Muslims to create a truly Americanized Muslim community, which will be pluralistic, which will allow different approaches. And the argument that the people who participated in our program make is that BDS is not effective. It's not working, obviously. And to impose an orthodoxy, a political orthodoxy, on an issue that many people in the Muslim American community quietly believe is a failed policy, and are beginning to wonder whether engagement with the mainstream Jewish community would be a more successful strategy, certainly for the future of the American Muslim. You know, if you're going to engage with Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, if that, and the Turei Karta, of course, you know, the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist lunatic who participated in Iran's Holocaust denial conference about 15 years ago. You know, if those are your addresses in the American Jewish community, then there will not be a Muslim-Jewish alliance in America. And many American Muslims realize that the future of their community really depends, at least in part, on finding allies among other minority communities. And the American Jewish community, with its tremendous track record on civil rights and human rights, is a natural address. And so what drove this program was not an interest in Israel, but an interest in the American, in an American Muslim-Jewish relationship. And they wanted to understand why American Jews love Israel. Why is Israel important to American Jews? Not to agree with Israel, not to become Muslim Zionists, as they're accused of being by the BDS, but to understand who you are, all of you, and how to engage with you in a more respectful way. Even how to disagree with you in a more respectful way.
Well, I think having the ability to disagree with one another in a respectful way is a big challenge across the board. So we have to learn. Talk about the fragmentation and tribalism of Israeli society. That you know, there's ethnic boundaries, politics, religion, culture. How do you approach and as somebody else to reduce that disunity?
You know, my starting point is the summer of 1982, which is when I made Aliyah, when I moved to Israel. And the summer of 1982 was one of the lowest points in the history of Israeli social cohesion. The Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War, had just begun. And that was Israel's most divisive moment, probably until the Rabin assassination or the Oslo process. And in some ways, the Lebanon War might have even been more traumatic than the Oslo process, because that was the moment when war, which always brought Israelis together, suddenly tore us apart. And for me to become an Israeli at the precise moment when the country was, in some ways, at least it felt then that it was disintegrating, was one of the great challenges for me in my life as an Israeli. Uh, what I can say in favor of that experience is that when you start off as an Israeli at one of the lowest moments in the country's history, it tends to look up after a while, and so the Israeli roller coaster, which is really what life in Israel is like, was really dipping at one of its lowest moments in 1980. 1982 is a moment when really the left-right divide was born in all of its intensity. It was the moment when the Ashkenazi-Mizrahi ethnic divide seemed to be leading towards civil war. The New York Times had a three-part series on the coming civil war, literally, the coming civil war between Jews from Arab countries and Jews from European backgrounds. Now, none of that happened. We did not have an ethnic civil war, and the left-right divide today has been replaced by a much softer political divide, which is between the right and the center. As I mentioned earlier, most of the Israeli left has disintegrated. There are many reasons for that, but the Israeli left has moved into the center. And center and the right are not that far apart. I would say the pragmatic right and the center are not that far apart on the Palestinian issue. If Israelis believed that there was really a chance for a peaceful resolution of the Palestinian tragedy, a real two-state solution that would end the conflict, you would have a majority, not only of the center, but I think of the pragmatic right supporting it as well. And we've seen that pattern play out in the past. When there's a real deal, there's always an Israeli majority. And so I think that that the social fissures here have changed. I wouldn't describe it as Ashkenazi Mizrahi anymore. One of the great unsung success stories of Israel is that Mizrahim and Ashkenazim fell in love with each other, married, and created families. That's now a normative part of Israel. You can't even tell anymore who's in my kids' generation who comes from which background. It's become so mixed that we really are ethnically in gathered society. It is one of the great joys of being an Israeli, is seeing that happen, and it really happened in these last 3 decades or so. And the left-right divide, as I say, has been softened, partly because of Palestinian intransigence. We don't feel that acute divide anymore. We don't feel, most Israelis, including people like myself who have deep animus toward this government, we don't feel that most of the blame is on our side. Some of it is, not most of it. So that's also softened the left-right debate. Instead, we have other fissures. We have the biggest fissure in Israel today is not between religious and secular. It's between the ultra-Orthodox and everyone else. That's a very subtle but important distinction, because it places people like me with a kippah in the everyone else camp, against the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox are a serious problem. They're 13% of the population. But the overwhelming majority of the population increasingly resents ultra-Orthodox power and is looking for ways to curtail it. And I think Corona is going to be a major turning point. So we have other divides. There is now a divide over democratic norms, which is something I never thought we would experience in Israel. I always assumed that there was a more or less a wall-to-wall consensus on Israel as a Jewish state and a democratic state, that's a given about who we are. Turns out it's not a given. That really worries me. And I'm worried about the Arab-Israeli, Jewish-Israeli relationship. That in some ways is our deepest divide. But there too, the Corona period has actually created some real opening. We've seen very powerful expressions of intimacy between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis in the Corona hospital wards, in the effort to doctors and nurses to fight the epidemic. So I think that there's real hope there as well. If anyone is interested in that topic, I can point you to an article that I wrote in the Atlantic a few months ago called Israel's Arab Moment. It appeared probably 4 months ago, in the good days before the second wave hit.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let me just ask you this. As time is running short, I'm going to be mindful of everybody's time. 12 months from now, hopefully we're going to welcome you here to Portland to come and speak to our community. What do you think you might be saying at that point in time?
Well, hopefully there'll be a Democratic president. And what I will be saying to you at that point is I'm really relieved for America, and I'm desperately worried about the revival of the Iran deal. And I hope that the American Jewish community will use its immense political capital in the Democratic Party to fight this thing, to make sure that if there's going to be a new deal, and there probably will be, it isn't a pretend improvement over the old deal, but a substantive improvement. So that is likely to be one message. Another is that we are likely to find ourselves in a more intensive phase of normalization with other Arab countries, even as the military conflict with Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas intensifies. And I think it will intensify in the coming months. Bear in mind that we are already at war with Iran. Every few days, we are hitting another military target in Syria. And it is the unspoken war, but it is very much a war. So far, it's been a one-way war. So far, the Iranians have been afraid of hitting back. But one of these days, they probably will hit back. Then we're going to be in a different.
Well, Yossi, thank you for taking part of your late afternoon, early evening with us. We always appreciate your insights.
Well, Mark, let's not end on that note. Let's end on a more hopeful note.
Perfect.
Which is that I really look forward to my next visit to Portland. I love Portland. Portland and Seattle are two of my favorite places in the world. And my daughter is living in Vancouver at the moment. And so I have real incentive for visiting. And my hope is that we're all going to look back on this time, this kind of nightmarish time in many ways, as a learning experience, as something precious that really gave us an opportunity for a reset, both individually, as communities, maybe as a people, as countries, and that we take advantage of this moment to ask ourselves some really hard questions and to think of ways in which our societies, our communities might be a little bit different coming out of Corona than we were going in. So I really enjoyed very much, as always, being with you, Mark, and thank you. Thank you for all you do. And I send my prayers to all of you. And Portland has really been so much on my mind, as has Seattle and other places of trauma in the last months, and really thinking of my Jewish friends in these communities. So.
We appreciate that, and you're welcome anytime. I just want to say thank you to you, Yossi. I want to say thank you to everybody who joined us for our Thoughtful Thursday and our morning time, different than our normal talks that we've done. Just a little piece that our next one will be on November 19th with Rabbi Elke Abramson from the Wexner Foundation. Should be really quite interesting. And Yossi, I'm glad we were able to provide you with a potential op-ed topic about Sudan.
Yes,
And I just want to share that I learned a new word, anarchic. So I wrote that down and did that. So thank you.
That's an important word for you in Portland.
I'm going to not only look it up more closely, but also learn how to use it in a sentence as you did. But I just want to say thank you. Your insights are always fantastic, and I appreciate you sharing with us. And enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you again.
Thank
and
you.
stay healthy. Stay healthy.
And you.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you.